But before break, we still have one presentation by Igor and Zuzanna, and I think it's going to be presented by Zuzanna.
Yes.
And that is about the RSE perspectives to mass liability. Please.
Yes, Igor pulled the shorter straw, and he doesn't get to speak today. I get to speak too. And a few comments on the subject, because we will, in our presentation, go back to those RSEs which were criticized yesterday. And I agree with that. This is a sort of, you mentioned, looking backwards, right, into how to incorporate mass within the existing legal systems, whereas I believe we need to look forward. But my problem is that when I was at the LEG committee last year, the main message from the LEG discussion was that they opt to discuss only LEG conventions. So only the conventions of LEG which are under the purview of the committee. And you mentioned that yesterday. I'm actually glad that nobody picked up on that, because my presentation will deal with that problem. Okay, so the idea for this presentation was to take the work done at the LEG committee so far, looking at the RSEs done, and to see how it would be best to approach the problems raised by the RSE. And again, that approach has been criticized. I understand that. I support the criticism, but unfortunately, this is the path that seems to be taken by LEG. So I want to at least have a look on how that could be done. And also the reason for this subject was more trivial. Together with Igor, we knew what are the other submissions, and we wanted to choose something different as not to step into the shoes of the other speakers. So with that, we have the recent LEG meeting last April, and there were some, I think, important and for me a little bit disappointing decisions made. First of all, we discussed the jurisdiction over RSE being in a different flag state. We talked about it yesterday. The CMI document was presented. I expected it would be a basis for a further discussion, but it wasn't. The majority of states said that there is no pressure of time, that we need to wait for the mass code to see what's in the mass code. But the most important message from them, which I mentioned again, was that they said they're interested only in LEG conventions and not the general liability problem, right? So they're going to talk about exclusions, as Professor Rozek mentioned, which is not a good approach, in my opinion. There were some delegations, for example, Japanese delegation, trying to pick up on a thorough research of all the problems based on the CMI document. But majority of the delegations, including the present representatives of the ship owners, the CSI, they said that we should only stick with the LEG conventions under the purview of the LEG committee. So this is something worrying. And what we can expect at the next LEG meeting in 2025, there will be an adoption of a roadmap. So LEG will definitely adopt a plan on how and when to approach LEG liability issues. Mass code will be already done, because mass code is supposed to be adopted at the MSC meeting 110, which will take place in May, I think, and LEG will meet in March. So there will be basis for more detailed discussion, something that, as they used as an excuse at the last meeting, we will have the prepared mass code. So I expect them to have the working group on mass. At the last LEG session, we didn't have a working group on mass, or even a corresponding working group. What the delegations decided is that the RSEs, the LEG RSE done, will be the basis for further research, right? But the whole RSEs are based on this assumption that we divide mass into 4 degrees of autonomy. And the new mass code goes away from that distinction. So there is this disparity of approaches, and that has to be taken into account in further works of the LEG committee. There was a proposal which seems to me a good solution. there was a proposal of creating a set of guidelines, and those guidelines would be apparently included in that roadmap. And these guidelines would be some sort of attempts to advise on how to approach LEC conventions. And I believe that depending on how detailed they are, there may be actually a better tool than the RSCs themselves to deal with the LEC conventions. And we did speak about that, so I'm going to skip and go to the next slide, which is what we still don't know, talking about mass code, what has to be decided until before the next year. And I think it has repercussions and it influences the discussion on liability issues as well. There is the question of mass master and some skeleton crew, right? The majority of the delegations at the MSC said if there is even a skeleton crew, the mass master has to be en masse. This was a different approach taken at the joint working group, but nevertheless, MSC made that decision, and this is something that will be included in the mass code. But for now, this is in brackets. So I guess they will go back to that issue and they will decide finally sometime before May 2025, whether in fact a mass master has to be on the mass if there is a skeleton crew. And we still need to go, mass code needs to go into the problem of certificates. The mass code includes a few, a chapter and a few norms on SOLAS and other certificates. But in fact, we don't know the details, how they will work. This is the work to be done still. And if it's made, then we could use that knowledge for the certificates under LEC conventions. So now, since the LEC committee is so decided to stick with the LEC conventions under their purview and to work with them, we can look into those guidelines as being a new tool to work with these LEC conventions. We don't know how they will look like in the future. There will be proposals coming this year, I believe, before the next mass. I have some suggestions. My suggestion is to draft guidelines looking at the key underlying concepts of every LEC conventions and see what mass changes and what we have to amend so that the key underlying concepts are still there when we have a mass operation under the conventions. With that, I think that those guidelines could be, in fact, a better tool than the RSCs themselves. But some issues will still need some policy decisions. Those that the key underlying guidelines don't give a clear answer, we will have to make some policy decisions. And it's important to have in mind that two ideas should be behind when making those policy decisions. This is that first, and somebody mentioned that before, the first victims should not be in worse position than in case of no mass scenario, and that unclear liability rules would in fact impede the progress of mass. So I would like you to give you an example of how these guidelines, which I thought about, could work in practice with a particular LEC convention. Not all of them, but LEC convention. I took CLC because CLC is, a mother convention, and in a sort, it was repeated in later LEC conventions, at least its basic characteristics. So first, what are the key concepts for this convention? And next, how we could maintain them with mass? Do they work with mass? So among the key concepts of the CLC, I think we agree. We have the strict liability with very limited exceptions, and this is explained by many theories of tort law, including the fact that those tankers bring a sort of excessive risk. There is one theory that talks about non-reciprocal risk. So that could be the justification for strict liability. In this case, we have channeling of liability to the ship owner, and we have virtually unbreakable limitation of liability. And more or less, we have this idea of equal share of the risk, of the burden of compensation between the ship side, the ship owner and the insurer, and the cargo side being the fund. So let's see whether those guidelines, the key concepts, are affected by mass operations. Just a few examples. First of all, if we look at the strict liability and its limited exceptions, CLC, as many other conventions we talked about, it brings that exception of no liability when the damage was wholly caused by the intent, right, of the other party. So in case of cyber attacks, being probably, we might expect that being the more common cause of damage with mass, ship owner with remaining exceptions would be generally relieved from liability as long as it is not proven that he contributed to that. And the question is it okay? Should we remain with that exception? When looking at the victims, that doesn't bother the victims because the victims can go with their claims to the fund. What happens is that this delicate balance of risks between the ship side and the fund side then is distorted because the fund takes over the liability from the ship. And historically, we had those private agreements like Tovalop and Crystal, and now we have Stopia and Topia that deal with balancing this imbalance. And I think that this would be a good solution. I believe that it's much more easy to change Stopia and Topia than the CLC convention. But if we take a different situation, that is the mass colliding with a tanker due to some technical malfunction or lost connectivity, then the CLC makes the tanker liable for the damage of the mass unless the tanker proves that there is negligence, fault on the side of the mass. And we discussed that will be difficult. Even if it is, it may be very difficult to prove. So the question is that fair? Right? This exception could be seen fair at in today's circumstances, in today's shipping, when fault might be proven, not as under mass. And also, it might have been explained by the fact that those tankers brought this non-reciprocal danger, the excessive danger in terms of different ships. But with mass being, well, we don't know yet, but being open for those cyber attacks, maybe we don't have this non-reciprocal theory behind. Maybe mass bring a risk which is comparable with the tankers. So maybe this provision would be something to think about for a change. Channeling of liability, remote operator, either employed by the ship owner or working as an independent contractor, the liability will be channeled to the ship owner. I have no problem with that under the CLC convention, and I think it works well with the spirit of the CLC. I think that was the idea behind the CLC. But if we think about the other persons that Eva brought to the light, talking about service provider, mass manufacturer, this is controversial. I would say that they are not covered by the channeling provisions. Similar situation was with the classification society. Many people thought that classification societies are not covered, but then we had the Erika judgment in which the French Supreme Court that classification societies are generally covered, although in that case it found willful misconduct on the part of classification society, but generally said that channeling of liability protects classification societies. So what I'm trying to say, if we leave that unchanged, I think we leave the doors for divergent interpretation, and I would see a problem here. Lastly, the limitation of liability, virtually unbreakable. We know that even after the resolutions providing this uniform interpretation on the test for breaking the limitation of liability, personal act with intent or recklessness, with the does it say with the knowledge, right, that the damage will happen. I mean, in case of mass and ship owner, that will be really, really high standard to break. But I think, again, this was in line with the intention behind the limitation of liability. So for me, actually, it works well. So this is how I would see working with the guidelines and the LEC conventions, but then going back to the heart of the problem. I would hope that the IMO does not navigate away from the main problem, which is not LEC conventions. I mean, as you see, there are some issues to discuss, but these are not the main problems. You know, when I was a student, I thought that IMO is that organization which is really happy to work on problems raised by shipping. Then when I started to write my PhD, I realized that maybe if an accident happens, then the IMO gets together and under the pressure, sometimes even public pressure, they bring new rules. Now, after participating in some LEC meetings, I have to say that I feel a sort of reluctance and I know this is recording, probably should not take that, this is not a diplomatic thing to say, but I can see some reluctance for taking new outputs and for LEC committee to work on general liability issues, we would need a new output. So we need delegations to bring this new output to the IMO agenda. And maybe this is also an appeal for all of us, that maybe we should start to talk with our governments who write instructions for our permanent representatives in the IMO to support those who think that general liability problems are in the heart of shipping. And I think that actually it is the IMO that should be that body to deal with those issues and not any other, right? If not IMO, then, well, we can discuss that. But I strongly believe that it should be the IMO. And with that, I'm in time finishing my presentation. Thank you so much.